that those whom he respects are not worthy of it, indeed, should be actively mistrusted. It's some sick ass shit. So basically, he's giving a speech talking about how to break someone, basically, and break them so that you can then empty them of their humanity and fill them with the false consciousness that would make them docile, willing participants of their own enslavement, right? And when the author Orisanmi points out the Orientalist orientation, instead of just using their own fucking history as a reference point, because this is something they've been doing for centuries. Like, these are techniques that were formed in some of the most oppressive times, which I'm talking about slavery, and then updated and used for different means before the same ends of subjugation in our current times. Instead of using their own cracker history to, say that, they reference Asians to say, to be like, oh, this is their barbarous techniques that they use, and that we're just trying to create a counter, when in actuality, this has always been the way of Western Empire and subjugating people that they find that they want to make inhuman. But I'll keep going. New York's Danmore State Hospital for the Criminally Insane, DSH, became a key site for these experiments. In 1966, Governor Rockefeller launched an effort to bolster the institution's status as a research hub by hiring teams of psychological and psychiatric consultants from the State University of New York system, the University of Vermont, and McGill University in Montreal. The latter institution is particularly notable because the psychology and psychiatry programs had received major funding from the Rockefeller Foundation, and because under the leadership of Donald O. Hebb and Ewen Cameron, respectively, both have been revealed as important sites of barbaric MK Ultra research. Grab some water. So basically, what Orisanmi does often and accurately in this work is point out basically like the middle class's role in maintaining these concentration camps and the role of academia. I'll keep going. With the aid of these consultants, the DSH, which was later rebranded the Adirondack Correctional Treatment Education Center, ACTEC, hosted an assortment of behavioral science experiments on incarcerated people. In 1967, Donald G. Forgraves, who graduated from McGill in 1950 and went on to chair the psychology department at the University of Vermont, was brought on as a co-principal investigator for a multi-year grant entitled Intensive Treatment Units, funded by the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, an MK Ultra conduit that Nelson Rockefeller helmed between 1953 and 1954. Topics of investigation included Muslim and Black nationalist groups, and a psychophysical study of time estimation in hospitalized felons with different degrees of isolation, themes that seem highly relevant to Messiah's subjection to the dark hole. In 1968, McGill's psychologists, as reading all these ways in which they perfected torture techniques on the rebels in Attica and in prison solitary confinement, and other ways in which they designed the cells to engage in part of developing that torture strategies that they end up using abroad within war and shit. It's interesting because it reminds me of, I can't remember that cracker's name, but basically the start of gynecology and how Black women's bodies were tortured, Black enslaved women tortured to create the foundation of gynecology, and how the foundations of many techniques they use to repress the minds of people everywhere that they seek to colonize, exploit, and subjugate. Those techniques these inmates, these captives, these people within prison are used in the same way to build. They literally were the foundation of our modern day techniques of controlling rebellion globally. Some wild shit, man. In 1968, McGill psychologist Ernest G. Poser conducted experiments on whether sociopaths and those deemed hopeless suffer from an adrenaline deficiency that retards their ability to learn, inhibiting impulses from fear-producing experiences. It's interesting because again, we're seeing again how certain studies that were done on captives literally fed the current ways in which we understand psychology today. That's interesting because then when we read and study these things, well, what it does for me, right, is I'll be like, yo, wait a minute. So if all these studies were done on quote unquote psychopaths and the hopeless is what they diagnosed or titled the captives who rebelled during the Attica uprising, doesn't that sound like drapetomania? And how Africans who were enslaved here in America were given that term because they're out of their minds. Why would they want to escape this type shit, right? It also too shows the role of and how we should be looking at a lot of institutions in mental health currently today, and how they demonize certain characteristics that are deemed rebellious, and then why would they? And then also too, it should have us look at the way in which we approach or they approach mental health, or allow us to say, oh, this is your mental health class. This is what mental health is. You being happy while there's multiple genocides going on. Or here's coping techniques that shows you're emotionally intelligent because you're able to cope and still show up to work every day, even though we are repressing you in the most violent of ways. And that's considered mentally healthy. I don't know, man. My mind be going all kind of place. Let me keep reading. The worry of this inquiry is notable for its Pavlovian specificity. Yo, the way he puts words be having me so fucking tongue-tied. Which goes beyond questions of thought and behavior into preconscious impulses elicited from different sociological states. To answer their question, Poser and a graduate student named Deborah G. Sitman injected captives with adrenaline and exposed them to electroshock treatments. By 1969, DSP staff had trained prison guards in hypnosis and aversion therapy techniques, resulting in scenes that an observer called quite revolting for those who watched and those who took part. God damn. The director of a think tank called the Narcotic and Drug Research Institute described ACTEC's therapeutic community program in ways that are eerily similar to CIA-sponsored efforts to liberate human consciousness in order to rebuild it anew. It takes you back to a kind of kindergarten level and then brings you back up, he told Congress. Man, there's so much shit that's going through my head right now. Because again, like in one part we read, they talked about their strategy in isolating them. And of course, they were in one part they're talking about physically. But I often think of the way in which we're, indoctrinated to be isolated, to isolate people based on how we perceive them and the labels that the state gives them. So, like when someone is deemed a terrorist or a group is deemed a threat to national security, right? Or you're labeled a Black identity extremist, how isolating that is. But then also too, for those that are held captive by the state in prisons, that we're propagandized to isolate them as well as now you're a criminal, therefore you can only be treated in one way. And those people who've been tortured in these concentration camps in the way that the captives are currently tortured today. And then in order for you to get parole, you got to go through a series of questions saying, I deserved what I got. And I'm reformed because I understand that I deserve what I got. And that when I go out, I will be an upstanding citizen of society. That sick shit that they go to. And then once they are convincing enough, then they're released and then further isolated by us, the population, because we've been taught to see them as only criminals, right? Or that the state is legitimate. Again, the way the system is built and the insidiousness of this shit should just set people's internal need to be free ablaze. Real talk. I'll keep going. The DSH-ACTEC was an ideal location for this controversial research. It was located in Dannemora, a small prison town just 25 miles from New York's northernmost border with Canada that earned the name Little Siberia because of its brutal winters and profound isolation. Moreover, because of an entrenched culture of white supremacy and economic dependence on prisons, Dannemora residents were unlikely to protest illegal or immoral activity perpetuated by prison authorities. Conveniently, DSH-ACTEC was adjacent to Clinic Unit 14. Sorry about that, really weird. Was adjacent to Clinic Unit 14, an arrangement that facilitated the quiet flow of human grist over the wall to be used for new experiments. God damn. So basically, they talk about how these prisons are located in majority white towns, and because these white towns are, dedicated to white supremacy, they're least likely to be engaged in trying to like overthrow the prisons because of the inhumane treatment that was inflicted upon captives. Which is, again, when people storm the prisons, they have to consider this. A lot of times when we talk about burning down the prisons, they're in these white enclaves that are heavily dedicated to maintaining the prison system and maintaining white supremacy as a whole. So you're not going to just be fighting like cops and CEOs or military. You're going to be fighting everyday people who deputize themselves on behalf of the state to protect the status quo. I'll keep reading. The DSH-ACTEC was an ideal. Oh, I'm sorry about that shit. While prison crats. Hold on, I lost my place. Conveniently, boom. DSH-ACTEC was adjacent to Clinton Unit 14, an arrangement that facilitated the quiet flow of human grist over the wall to be used for new experiments. For incarcerated people, these transfers were a site of constant physical and verbal resistance. Dr. Forgraves wrote that he frequently observed Black militants brought to the DSH in leg irons and straitjackets, kicking, fighting, cursing, spitting in the faces of guards, and otherwise breaking every rule, adding that these were the types that incited rebellions in San Quentin and Attica. While prison crats used the possibility of punitive transfer to Unit 14 as a system-wide threat to produce obedience across the captive population, an even more terrifying threat was that one might be sent to the hospital, where, rumor had it, captives were lobotomized. God damn. Wild. Plans for what became the RX program were set in motion during the summer of 1971, during the brief interim between the Auburn and Attica rebellions. According to notes from DOCS, Mental Health Services Task Force, which included prison administrators, representatives from the Department of Mental Hygiene, a state Supreme Court judge, and academic consultants, including Forgraves. Commissioner Oswald directed that consideration be given to behavior modification and whether serious thought should be given to segregating the unteachables, militants, for example, so that we can then go about with the constructive programs with the major part of the population. In other words, Oswald's progressive and humanizing reforms hinged upon the targeted neutralization of these unteachables. Yo, again, which is why anti-Blackness is the root of all of this shit. And when people connect struggles, you're going to see a concerted effort, especially from people in like academia and shit. Like when I say academia, I mean like Noam Chomsky, who wrote a piece talking about like, oh, what's happening in Palestine can't be compared to South Africa's apartheid because it's just different. Basically, he goes into a whole word salad, but basically I see that as anti-Blackness, because what do you mean they're not the same? Oftentimes they try to disconnect the struggles between, things that are going on in Palestine, between things that are going on in other parts of the global South, and even try to disconnect the ongoing genocide of people in America from the ongoing colonization and the rescramble for Africa that's going on the continent. And those divisions are made on purpose. Because if we connect them all, we understand that this is a settler colonial project that is going exactly the way it's supposed to. The system is not broke. So we don't need to fix the shit. We need to burn it the fuck down. And that oftentimes the concessions that are made, the liberal concessions that are made, aren't progress, even though we're indoctrinated to see that as such. That is actually helping the system to update itself to become even more repressive, but put us in a sense of safety, in a sense, a lull of, oh, okay, the system, if it can concede to this, if it can give me this privilege, that must mean that it can be reasoned with when it can't. And during that lull, during that pacification, is when the system oftentimes turns up its violent repression. So much to be learned from what happened to our people locked up in Attica and other prison uprisings here in America. These prisons are concentration camps. That's no hyperbole. I'm going to keep reading. Officially launched in December of 1972, the RX program and ACTEC constituted a post-Attica rebranding of long-standing practices of experimentation. According to the program manual, which Mazia and I located amid a massive pile of documents in his bedroom, the initiative aimed to make imprisoned militants easier to control while producing generalizable knowledge with application beyond prisons. In DOCS words, its purpose was controlling and treating inmates who have become clearly unresponsive to the routine correctional experience, while also providing a base for both departmental and outside scholarly research as to the nature of abhorrent behavior patterns, the behavior and delineation of appropriate techniques of treatment and prevention. So that's a lot of fucking words. But basically, let me grab some water. So basically, they created a program in which to control inmates, and the way they did it was to break their mind in any way that we have seen during, like, in Gitmo and Guantanamo Bay and black sites. I mean, even here in America, there is a book called The Torture Machine, in which it describes black torture sites here in Chicago. And if you study the way in which they torture these people in other areas of Western imperialism, right? It mirrors exactly what these people went through in Attica, in Auburn, in these psych wards and other places, mental institutions, and so on. I would hope people listening and reading would ask themselves why, because then that question would lead to an analysis of your current condition, being that in a protracted war, and that any form of a resistance is met with this kind of repressive violence. So while they got us like doing this dance in America of we need to choose the lesser to evil, I'm begging us collectively to decide we don't fuck with evil at all and just start chopping these motherfuckers' heads off for real and burning down these prisons. Little about what was taking place in ACTEC was how it appeared on the surface. Oh, real quick. Also, too, as we read about, the Long Attica Revolt in this book, it should also make sense, or we should understand clearer why the state reacted to the people in Atlanta who were resisting Cop City, the building of Cop City, and why they were met with like RICO charges and all these charges that people were like, wait a goddamn minute, for protesting? Yes, they are direct. This is how the state acts in a protracted war. So then we would see that whole strategy, respectability, politics of trying to paint ourselves as peaceful does no good and only helps the state. Little about what was taking place in ACTEC was how it appeared on the surface. According to the official count from February 1973, the institution held 455 captives. However, as a diversified institution, ACTEC operated maraud programs dispersed across several buildings, each of which contained multiple wards, floors, and wings, ensuring the captives in the same institution could have widely different experiences. The institutional archive is crammed with letters from captives pleading for transfer into ACTEC, specifically its Diagnostic and Treatment Center, which promised to improve one's chances of earning parole. But that program was distinct from RX, where candidates had to be nominated by a program committee based in Albany. And I can tell you, in my correspondence with people currently locked up, this is exactly how the prisons run today, where you can have a wildly different experience as a captive depending on what floor you're on. And then also, too, depending on what ward you're in and what building you're in. Man, and that it's like this class bill system that they've created that is wildly violent, but certain classes are so fucking violent that it will have you begging to go into the mental ward to be experimented on, and you will sign your rights away and everything just to get out of the previous hell on the second floor or third floor, Maziah refused his RX nomination in the spring of 1973. In a letter addressed to him at Clinton, Commissioner Oswald wrote, "I am truly sorry to learn that you view this program as a conspiracy against you and an effort to impede your pending litigation." Maziah had evolved into a formidable jailhouse lawyer who had a major lawsuit pending against DOCS and who had already succeeded in reducing his maximum sentence to 15 years, meaning that DOCS would soon be forced to release him. Attempting to dispel some of the more bizarre rumors, Oswald emphasized that the program does not include cruel and unusual punishment, does not involve the use of drugs, and will never involve psychosurgical operations to alter behavior. In his reply, Maziah restated his position. "Once again, I will not volunteer for the so-called RX, which in reality, its primary objective is to engender marked change of political prisoners' patterns of behavior and attitudes, to systemically undermine the fundamental fibers of their third world outlook into which their behavior and attitude patterns are reflected. He and others would not allow themselves to be transformed into docile creatures, robot slaves, or neo-slaves," he continued. So basically, Maziah said all this. He's like, "Yo, I'm not signing this fucking paper and signing my life over. I don't buy your lies." So basically, Oswald tried to paint it as, "Oh, this is all in your head. Those are conspiracy theories. We would never do experiments on people. We wouldn't be torturing people. We wouldn't be doing all that shit. Mind control people and break people and to make them into passive robot slaves. We're not doing none of that." And Maziah was like, "Yes, the fuck you are, and I'm not going to wait on your word to confess that. I'm going to lean into my own understanding, my own analysis of my material conditions, and I'm not signing my life over to you. And I refuse to let you sit there and break me and make me unhuman." Yo. And that's after he had already been tortured all this time. Yo. The mental fortitude, bro. I have a headache and it's hard for me not to end it all. I'm just saying. Like a whole revolutionary minded. I hope one day to have that type of mental fortitude. What happened next could have been taken from the pages of a dystopian science fiction. On March 22nd, 1973, approximately 15 CRT guards, all of whom were clad in full riot gear and armed with gas guns, shields, and batons, descended on both entrances of Maziah's Unit 14 cage. At this point in his narrative, he reminds me that he did thousands of push-ups per day, is skilled in various styles of martial arts, and had defended himself against armed goon squads before. He told me he knew that they would be coming for him, and that his plan was to subdue his assailants, liberate anyone on the tier, escape from Clinton, flee across the Canadian border, and link up with the Black Underground. The militant audacity of his radical imagination and will speaks to why the state went to such lengths to control him. Now, I be getting excited when I read that shit. Like, how can you not? Yo, let's trace it back. Masai talks about how he was radicalized through other Muslim brothers who talked to Malcolm X, who disguised himself as a Christian preacher so he would be allowed into these prisons. And through that underground, doing that espionage, doing that, tactic of radicalization, he was able to sustain some of the most evil fucking torture, where he had to squat with his knees and his elbows squatted and be in his own filth for days, tortured, beaten, sexually assaulted. And in that, he had the revolutionary zeal and spirit to train and be ready for what was coming. Y'all. And that I like the part where Orisanmi says, it makes sense that this type of revolutionary, why they were so adamant that they were going, if he wouldn't sign the consent form to go and get, broken in by psychological techniques, torture techniques, then they were going to take him by force because they had to subdue such a revolutionary person like that. That should also light a fire within people listening to this that, yo, they're doing all this shit in Palestine to squash the resistance. They're doing all this shit on the continent for this fucking long. They're doing all this shit in West Papua. They're doing all this shit in fucking Texas, Louisiana, Florida, all of fucking America. They're doing all this to suppress the oppressed because why? Because I'm telling y'all, once we stand the fuck up, it's a wrap. It's a wrap. And we can make the world the way we want to with full autonomy and self-determination. But we have to stand up. Let me get some water. Sorry, I'm mad sick too, so I'm just going to power through this. A DOCS communique claims that Masai resisted, forcing the CRT to employ necessary force to complete his transfer. However, a signed affidavit by Masai's attorney published accounts in the Black Panther Midnight Special and Prisoners Digest International, and Masai himself claims otherwise. According to these sources, Masai was given no opportunity to resist. Rather, CRT agents preemptively fired 4 canisters of tear gas into his cell, one of which would have smashed into his face and caused serious injury had he not dodged it. Unit 14 was soon consumed with gas, causing the entire tier and even the masked assailants to experience intense pain. Masai maintains that normally the use of gas would not have slowed him down, that we had been gassed so many times before that we were immune. A claim I have heard from others who endured similar forms of repression. He is certain, however, that in this instance, CRT agents used a special compound of military CS gas. I would rather them shoot me with a shotgun, he told me. It blinded me, and I couldn't hardly breathe. I was suffocating like I was drowning in water. I became hopeless and helpless. I became like a baby. I couldn't defend myself. His assertion that this chemical weapon made him helpless like a baby provides a potential clue into the authoritarian means by which carceral technologists reduce people to kindergarten level before attempting to reprogram and reconstitute them anew. Basically, how I interpret that sentence is prior, the mention of kindergarten level in quotes was in a report on strategies on what they wanted to get out of certain studies. So that tells me that they literally studied to make a gas to create this response specifically for captives that were considered revolutionary. Some sick fucking shit. And again, he just paints the picture because these are all regular ass people that we live next door to, that we live in the same cities with, that go to the same, grocery stores, all that. Like, this is the middle class, participation in maintaining a police state and torture techniques to torture and repress revolutionaries. It's really good to understand that, because then when they talk to us, it makes more sense why they, why they're so invested in maintaining the system, because they have certain privileges in carrying out these type of roles in empire. So yes, they will co-sign a genocide, or they'll co-sign any genocide in chief, as long as it means maintaining their privilege in the society over others. Messiah's recollections. Hold on, grab some water. Messiah's recollections of exactly what happened next, the sequence of events, the names and faces of the people he interacted with, and the particulars of the regimen he was subjected to, all largely inaccessible. They emerge not as a coherent narrative, but as a series of impressions, which I gathered through a repeated inquiry. The gaps in his recollection are unsurprising, given the memories are notoriously imperfect, especially across the passage of time and in instances of severe trauma. Moreover, it is entirely plausible that Messiah's assailants sought to delete or otherwise manipulate his memories, as this was one of the formative objectives of MK Ultra. It is significant, though, that by combing through state archives, I have been able to corroborate much of what he managed to recall. You know what? Reading this is interesting because it makes me think of the Illuminati, right? And I'm like, yo, that's a psyop, because the way in which they've been able to co-opt the history of MK Ultra to the point where now it seems the stories that are widely circulated are so absurd or whatever, or trivial, like, oh, Nicki Minaj is MK Ultra because she has Baphomet on her t-shirt. And it's like, no, nigga, they literally use MK Ultra to control the minds of revolutionaries, to break them, to distort their memories so that they can't recall the torture that they went through and why. And also used to repress people that are resisting globally. Like, it's white supremacy. I get pissed off because I see a resurgence of that shit. And the same people who would deny the violent nature of white supremacy, capitalism, patriarchy, will co-sign the existence of Illuminati. And it blows my fucking mind. But by design. Actually by design. The next thing Messiah remembers is waking up in a cold shower and being referred to by his new designation, RX-21. Another in a long line of depersonalizing names thrust upon him by the state. He was then told by someone using what he describes as a Chinese accent not to scrub the particular residue left by the gas unless he wanted his skin to peel off. An interdepartmental communication reveals that Messiah's interlocutor was Dr. Pablo M., and I'm going to butcher this name, Lomangkalab, a psychiatrist of Filipino descent and a member of the U.S. Army Medical Corps. According to the memo, Dr. Lomangkalab provided RX-21 with the proper decontamination treatment, ensuring that no permanent damage was incurred. Messiah was now in RX program's diagnostic phase, a 4 to 6 week process during which he would be tested and probed. Depending on the results, he would remain in ACTEC or be transferred to a so-called open prescription program amid the general population in a designated maximum security prison. As his vision began to recover, a process that took weeks, Messiah was able to assess his surroundings. He was inside a small windowless enclosure that was totally empty, save for a toilet and a bed, which was affixed to the floor. The bareness of the cell was central to the broader strategy of behavior modification. Like similar programs in the federal prison system, the RX program employed an operant conditioning model in which conformance to program expectations allowed targets to earn privileges like toiletries, additional clothing, writing implementations, stationary stamps, time outside the cell, and a social interaction. God. Like I said, so basically what they said is that They gave themselves that were bare except for like a toilet and a bed on purpose because they would implement a system in which they, if they conformed, they would get rewarded with privileges in which they can decorate themselves. I'm laughing because I'm pissed because when you think about it, don't that sound like us going to work? Sitting up here fighting for higher wages, more privileges instead of burning this plantation to the fucking ground. Literally got people adopting, white replacement theory and blackface, where they're talking about immigrants are taking my job. Like they're taking the role on the our role on the plantation that we should be burning the fuck down. Like, yo, I hate white supremacy. I fucking do. Let me finish reading. Oh my God. And it's interesting because, like, when I talk to my people locked up, they talk about how the system is still in place. Like, there's parts in like, you'll go to a different floor and you'll get certain privileges. And the only way to go to a different floor is that, you do good things. It's not enough just to behave, like to go in your cell and don't get any fights. Psh, that's not it. You have to also like snitch on other people, set up other people. If the CEO comes to you and say, hey, do such and such to this person, and you do it, that you get rewarded with a privilege. You get moved to a better cell. You get an extra roll of toilet paper. You might get to take 2 showers instead of 1 this week. Shit like that. So it creates this system where one, organizing against the guards' ongoing violence against the captives, you are looked at by other inmates as someone weak, as someone who's messing up the system. So they'll suppress you before anything. And then also, too, it creates a system where they begin to set each other up so that they can get certain rewards and begin snitching on each other. And then they basically police themselves, which, again, is literally how we use police today. We'll call them when our neighbor steals from the store some food, because how dare you steal food when food should be free? Should be free. And the fact that there's hungry people, we should burn this shit down off GP. Let me keep reading. I'll be here forever. Hold on. Operant conditionings and its Pavlovian counterpart, classical conditioning, where positives as well as negative stimuli are used to induce the desired behavior, have always been part of the arsenal of carceral power. What distinguishes their use in behavior modification regimes is their intensive application on specific individuals as parts of an allegedly objective science of social control. As Dr. Edgar Sheen explained, prison managers invented the concept of isolating people long before social scientists got around to documenting effects of such isolation, and the withholding of mail or visiting privileges to Black male prisoners into behaving themselves is as old as prisons themselves. And how I interpret that is this. So basically, if I'm comprehending this right, it talks about how they knew the outcomes of depriving people of certain privileges, like getting letters from loved ones, visitations, giving certain people certain trinkets they could put in their cell, extra showers, blase, that they knew the consequences of doing that and to isolating those who didn't comply. They knew the result. So then when we get the whole, when people start raising more alarm on these conditions, and all of a sudden they're like, okay, y'all, guess what? Well, we did a study and we found out in that study that this is what happens. That we should also look at that as counterinsurgency, because a lot of times what ends up happening is that you'll have people who will, let's say, protest, right? And then a concession of that protest would be like, okay, guys, we'll give money and grants to certain people to conduct a study. And then what you'll end up getting is everyone applying for grants creates more jobs. And now they have this so-called quote unquote study, what is already known to be true, because that's the reason why it's that way in the first fucking place. But now you have all these people with jobs, right? Because of this study. So now you have a new crop of people to act as a buffer class because their conditions are made better by the existence of this quote unquote study. And that study is often presented as like a concession or a sign of progress, Because, yeah, we're studying ourselves now to know why this is happening, even though we created traditions so that it could happen. I hope I'm making sense. That when we study like the ways in which they did this in prison, that when the way the state responds to us when we revolt, we'll be able to tell the bullshit from the real. So like when they say, "Oh y'all, we need to study," no, the fuck they don't. Keep going, keep burning shit down. Or they say, "Here's a concession: we're giving grants so that people can come up with solutions." Nope, no, they're not. They're buying time so the state can can restructure itself so that it can further repress us while we fall into a sense of pacification. If we start approaching the things in that way, we wouldn't be happy when our favorite politician or the politician we voted for wins. We would know that that's not important. We need to get free. The shit has got to go. And all those that serve as a buffer class, all those who serve as, investing in this carceral system, in this cellular system, period, they got to go too. Let me go. Let me keep going, man. I really got to get some rest. COVID is kicking my ass, man. Describing his new surroundings as a spy cell, Mazi explained how his captors facetiously recorded, tracked, and analyzed everything he and others did. This too was corroborated by the State Archive, commenting on the suitability of ACTEC as a site for behavior modification research. Forgaze noted that it had several rooms with one-way viewing potential, voice monitoring and recording, and polygraph recording. The program documents shows that RX guards were trained to surveil a wide variety of behaviors on a daily and sometimes hourly basis. Exercise, sleep, bed making, cleanliness, bathing habits, reading habits, eating habits, and bowel movements, use of foul language, and conversations with peers, to name a few. Data points produced by this perverse colonial gaze were then arranged on longitude graphs and analyzed for changes over time. Like skilled computer programmers, ACTEC experts aim to grasp all of their variables. NOI members Tyrone O'Neill, aka RX8, told the local press that prison crats were subjecting him to psychological and psychochemical terror. During a 1973 interview from the Brooklyn House of Detention, Duruba bin Wahad told a reporter that the RX program was geared towards tampering with people's brains, towards using drugs, towards turning people into vegetables. Unsurprisingly, administrators dismissed such accusations as conspiracy theories and brushed aside the suggestiveness of this program's name, Prescription RX, as an unfortunate coincidence. They accused the captives of paranoid thinking and of doing battle in a war that doesn't exist. However, it must be remembered that people incarcerated in more standard carceral institutions had long accused their keepers of employing drugs as pacification strategy. As I've already shown, captives in Greenhaven were convinced that authorities were facilitating the flow of alcohol, marijuana, and cocaine into prison walls in order to stifle their will to resist. They allow a certain amount of drugs in prison, explained Auburn and Attica survivor Joma Omowale, adding that this policy comes all the way from the White House. Although claims such as Omowale's are rarely taken seriously, high-level government complicity in the flows of drugs across U.S. borders is a matter of public record. Time the whole fuck out. Sorry, y'all, like a light bulb just went in my head because we're reading about this. This is happening between 62 to mid-70s. Crack was introduced to Black communities in the fucking 80s. So again, when people say that the state put crack in the ghettos deliberately to suppress rebellion and to alter people's minds so that they could be, passive during their ongoing repression, motherfuckers wasn't making that up. That's an accurate analysis, and it was practiced on revolutionaries that were captured by the state and experimented on. So they experimented on the people in prisons that were part of the Black Liberation Army and BPP and other revolutionary organizations, right? And also those that were radicalized behind bars. who led revolts, and then used that on the people outside in the 80s and so on, and continue to do so today. A lot of the times we don't hear about some of the tortures that go on, or if we do hear about it, it's isolated in a way where it's like, oh, these sadistic guards tortured them in prison. We don't often tie it to how these torture techniques and these experiments on people that are held captive by the state today, that is tied to creating strategies in which to repress us out here too. And that the reason why they are tortured and the violence happens in prisons, the conditions are made that way for a specific purpose, to have a specific outcome, and it all ties to suppressing rebellion inside the walls in these concentration camps we call prisons, and also to squash rebellion outside of the walls in our neighborhoods and our blocks, which is just an open air prison. I'll keep reading. Describing his brief encounter with the RX program, an Attica brother named Carlos Roach relayed a story that sounded a lot like MK Ultra. He told me that after refusing to volunteer, he showed his nomination letter to Elizabeth Fink, an attorney for the Attica brothers. Fink purportedly showed the letter to Joseph Henderson, a federal judge for the Western District of New York, who investigated the program and, according to Roach, learned that the Department of Defense gave the Department of Justice a grant to pass down to state prisons to test out this medication on cons that had wanted to use. Sorry, I read that really wrong. The Department of Defense gave the Department of Justice a grant to pass down to state prisons to test out this medication on cons that had wanted to use on dudes coming back from Vietnam. God damn. So basically, they had got this grant to use a experimental drug on inmates that they were going to use on soldiers coming back from Vietnam. This was a startling claim that Roach conveyed to me with certitude, and before I mentioned my search for evidence linking the program to the military-industrial complex and the CIA. The preceding chapters have discussed the prison as a zone of active combat, but Roach's recollection illuminates the prison as war in another sense. It suggests that the counterinsurgent state is invented, developed, refined, and reconstituted through its material connection to carceral systems, with the latter serving as a primary locus of Black revolutionary insurgency, and therefore a primary locus of state counterinsurgency research and development. Unfortunately, I cannot corroborate this statement because Fink and Henderson had already passed away. As we will soon see, however, I later found information that supported his claim. Masai told me that penal authorities had drugged and attempted to poison him before his stint in ACTEC, and he did not see this common strategy of control as particularly scandalous. For him, it was more important for the world to understand that the RX program involved what he called sex experiments. Within the prison context, food is always a technology of control, but regarding to Mazia, this was even more evident in ACTEC. He claims that the food was much more enticing than in other prisons, but that it had been infused with specific drugs that caused the population to become excessively horny, to masturbate all day, and to turn us into homos, and to make us want to rape each other. Among Mazia's various assertions, the claim that the state was trying to manipulate people's sexual desires strained my credulity. Credulity? I think I said that really wrong. I was especially skeptical given that he claims to have ever eaten the food, that he protested his forced transfer by immediately going on a hunger strike, and therefore only witnessed these symptoms or was told about them by others who experienced them. I considered excluding these assertions from the narrative on this basis, and because my own discomfort with Mazia's homophobic language and the way that some of these notions play into misguided conceptions of homosexuality as unnatural or pathological. However, Given that he was entrusting me with his story, I continued to trust him and to take him seriously as a chronicler of narrator of his experience. I scoured the archive for traces of corroborating evidence, and what I found astounded me. Successful grant applications and evaluations reveal that under the leadership of Donald G. Forges, ACTEC did in fact host sexual experiments. One project involved the study of people in prison for what Forges called sexual deviancy crimes other than homosexuality, a category that Mazia technically fit, his claim of having been framed for rape notwithstanding. Another study was curiously entitled Sexual Conditioning with Non-Dominant Responses. Little else is revealed about this project except that researchers understood that if exposed, they would be liable to repercussions. Then there was a study entitled Behavioral Therapy, Homosexuality. According to Forges, the basic approach of this project will be to use slides of male and female adult figures, a strain gauge on the penis of the subject, and electric shock as the adverse stimulus in a typical operant conditioning paradigm. Similar experiments were being performed at roughly the same time by researchers in California state prisons, specifically, I don't know how to say that word, Atasarero State Hospital, popularly known as the Chow for Queers, in Vacaville Medical Facility, which the CIA was forced to admit was an MK Ultra test site. Using incarcerated deviants, militants, and malcontents as raw material, ACTEC functioned as laboratory where respected members of the academic community experimented with scientific forms of sexual grooming and rape. After violently reducing them to childlike state, they subjected those over whom they exercised asystemical power to coercive medical and scientific techniques that aimed to cultivate sexual desires, orientations, and practices that were contrary to their will and suited the needs of those who aimed to control them. It's interesting because there's this one book on some of the tortures that was used against people that were colonized, and also too in prisons, right? That talks about how, because oftentimes when people hear of like rape and sexual assault, because of homophobia and the way we've been indoctrinated to be homophobia, we think that oh my God, they're trying to turn us gay. And it's like, no, actually what they said they were trying to do is, can I force you to be something that you're not? Like, it's just like a gay conversion camp, right? You send people who are gay to a camp. Why? To control their behavior, to modify it. Can you change someone from who they are? Can you bend free will? And can you have them adopt a false identity, right? That's what all this is about. So what they would do is, right, they would show them pictures of naked men and women and see if electric shock or what level of coercion through violent sexual and violent psychological torture and physical torture, can we get them to like something that they didn't like before? Or can we get them to behave in a way in which we want them to behave? So it's all about behavioral modification, and that if you rest in your conditioning, in your homophobia and your transphobia and shit, you would be unwilling to see the full picture of which the state is operating. And what will happen is you'll be unable to analyze your material conditions in a way in which to develop a strategy that is sustainable in order to get you free. What will end up happening is you'll end up just helping the state further imprison you. So had to break that the fuck down. I'll get back to reading. After violently for Forges and others, these practices of scientific sexual racism, domination, and violence were inextricable from the political objective of countering insurgency. It was our conviction, wrote Forges, that various groups of inmates in the system, e.g. the overt homosexual, the militant, the non-cooperatives, etc., constituted a set of problems to whose solution mental health and behavior science professionals could possibly contribute. Boom. Told you. Because people think just because I'm gay that I'm like, oh, she's making excuses. It's like, nah, nigga, I know what the fuck I'm talking about. Because it literally said the people that they targeted people who were already gay in prison to these sexual experiments to see if they can flip them and change them, just like they have gay conversion camps in America. So this whole, the trans panic and the homophobia panic, we should already see that as a psyop. And that, again, is a means of social engineering. So that, again, that they can continue to marginalize those so that they can capture them and do away with them, so that those who are revolutionary, who revolt, who will go against the system, who will radicalize others to do the same, they set up these systems of control in order to do away with them. So that the rest of the populace that's left is easier to repress. Which is why I say homophobes and transphobes are agents of the fucking state. And they say it too. So I'm trying to tell you. These academic experts aim to manipulate and remold the most intimate parts of people's personality. And this could be achieved. Perhaps they could also reshape their loyalty, their political affinities, and their personal aspirations. Against the dominant conception of the prison as a site of criminal justice that is marginal to global concerns, these experiments illuminate the prison as a site of incubation for technologies that are central to reproduction of empire. Hello. My research strongly suggests that Dr. Forgay's unethical experiments were carried out on behalf of the CIA. At the very least, the imperatives of his intensive treatment units program were shaped by the agency's global brain warfare agenda. Previous research has revealed that the psychologist Donald O. Hebb, Forgay's mentor at McGill, played a central role in helping the CIA understand the implications of sensory deprivation for manipulating the mind. Between 1955 and 1957, which is, I don't know if I want to go into that because people can literally hijack it and co-opt it for a totally different meaning for what I mean, because I'll just use a different example. So the way in which you can kind of draw parallels into like this strategy being implemented on us on the outside is gentrification. Gentrification in itself is an isolating tool, because if you're constantly having to move because you can't afford to be where you're at, how do you build community? How do you say, oh, this is my childhood friend that I grew up with, went to the same school, or, you know, my teacher is actually like my mom's best friend from high school, because community, you're able to grow and expand and create over time connections, right? Those become ties that are hard to break through simple repression, right? You'll end up fighting for each other. You'll want to get free by any means necessary. You won't allow your neighbor to be arrested by police because, you know, you care for them, you grew up with them, and it goes back, right? So anyways, when you have gentrification that displaces individuals in that way, they're unable to form those same bonds because they're constantly having to move. Like with apartment complex, it's rare that someone stays in one apartment for 20 years nowadays, because rent goes up every time you sign a new lease. So with rent going up, you have to move to a cheaper apartment, or your job lays you off. Now you have to move to a different side of town where, you know, the accommodations are a lot less expensive, or whatever the case, right? So what ends up happening is that you become isolated. And during these times of isolation, we notice, especially within the last like 15 years, how radicalized people have become to believe in some of the most absurd shit you could ever think of. It then makes sense why in that condition, under that type of repression, right? And of course, other violent repressions by the state, that then a motherfucker with Cheeto dust on his face can get on stage and say, hey, you should drink bleach, and people do it. Or like how a billionaire can get poor people to donate $52 million. Like, or how people describe like these politicians as their saviors, as someone that would help, instead of seeing them for what they are, literally guards to ourselves. Some Matrix type shit, but let me keep going. Get some water. And again, the practice was perfected on revolutionaries that they kidnapped in the 60s and put in prison and experimented on them, and also other inmates who were poor, gay, and all the stuff that they listed already. While at the University of Vermont, under the auspices of Project Themis, a Department of Defense effort to draw university-based academics into the Cold War effort, Forgaze followed in Hebb's footsteps. In 1968, the DoD awarded Forgaze a 3-year grant of well over $500,000 to perform a study entitled Isolation and Sensory Communication. It aims, according to Forgaze, was to study individual differences in the influence of sensory isolation upon psychological and physiological functioning, and also to employ the isolatory environment as an appropriate one in which to study other aspects of human functioning, including subject attitude and personality characteristics. Methods included confining people to water immersion and air isolation tanks for as much as a month at a time, while exposing them to forms of auditory indoctrination that run counter to specific subject attitudes. Critically, Forgaze and his colleagues, Robert B. Lawson, were conducting this research at the same time they were consulting with DOCS. So basically, academics giving grants by the DoD, Department of Defense, were experimenting on inmates in the most sick ways. And see, they don't describe the Attica uprising in this way. They don't describe the repression of, revolutionaries in this way. We're oftentimes given down a very watery version of this. Where, oh yeah, some got locked up, stayed in prison, might have played some chess, might have converted to Islam, basic stuff. And it's like, nah, these motherfuckers was tortured. And then the results of that torture is what they used in order to create certain programs to inflict upon the people on the outside to quell rebellion out here, and again, to create passive people in their own subjection. This is some sick shit. Let's see. Forgaze's relationship with the military-industrial complex preceded Project Themis by well over a decade. After completing his PhD in 1950, Forgaze did a tour of duty in the Korean War. Throughout that decade, according to his CV, most of his research output circulated as internal memos and technical reports for the RAND Corporation and an innocuous-sounding agency called the Human Resource Research Center, which was located at the Rudolph and Lackland Air Force Base in Texas. When I learned this, I immediately remembered what Carlos Roche told me, that RX program administrators were testing drugs on incarcerated people on behalf of the Air Force. As if this web of connections was not convincing enough, Forgaze was stationed at Lackland during the early 1950s, at the same time that the base's heads of psychiatry was Douglas Lewis Joyland West, a high-level MK Ultra asset. By tracing these intellectual and institutional networks, we can see how prisons function as central nodes within global networks of counterinsurgency knowledge production. This knowledge is coercively extracted from captive Black revolutionaries and deployed in the broader world. Brain warfare initiatives built on already existing practices of colonial domination that had long flourished in and around prisons. As I showed in Chapter 4, the Long Attica Revolt presented state actors, mass media, and white civil society with a rare opportunity to intensify and publicly display violent rituals of sexual racism that undergird the social order under normal conditions. The experiments in ACTEC extended the Attica massacre not only because of their counterinsurgent objective, but also because of their intensely sexualized methods. Whether enacted through the brutal intimacy of physical violence or at the scientific remove of physical violence or at the scientific remove of a laboratory, these rituals and technologies aim to penetrate captive bodies, to liberate their will to resist, and fortify patriarchal relations of white supremacy and sexual masteries. Again, another parallel, because as more reports are coming out of Palestine of captives being sexually tortured, homophobia would have you see that as, oh my God, they're trying to create gay people. And it's like, no, actually, these are tested methods of torture and breaking of human beings so that you can quell a resistance. And that they do it to gay people too. Like, it is about controlling a human being, torturing and doing grotesque experiments on people to see what will work and what fails, and then refine your approach to repressing people and taking away their autonomy. Again, I just urge people to continue to grapple with that, because then you will understand why you have to support resistance globally, because this is what they're resisting. The results of the studies at ACTEC and of this broader research agenda are difficult to ascertain, not least because the powerful administrators of these programs wanted it that way. However, we can safely assert that, at best, the results were mixed. A survey of sensory deprivation research found that isolation enhances people's susceptibility to external influence, essentially starving them of information and maximizing the impact and the reward value of whatever information is made available. Yo, I'm not going to go into that because I already went on a whole spiel about that. But just to break it down, basically they're torturing of inmates and experimenting on Black revolutionaries in prison led them to the analysis that, okay, if we isolate people, not only can it restrict them of any knowledge or ability to assess their material conditions and revolt, but it can also make them susceptible to information we want them to have, and make them susceptible to be trained to have certain actions that we want, that benefits the state, that benefits what we want. So we want to convince people that their goal in life is to just reproduce more bodies for the capitalist system. They will do that. And it will be called romantic. And it will be a goal of theirs. And they will look at that as freedom, even though that only serves the state and the empire. That's just an example. But yeah, you know what? Let me keep reading. But it also notes that the subjects, let me make sure I didn't skip anything. The results of the studies at ACTEC and of this broader research agenda are difficult to ascertain, not least because the powerful administrators of these programs wanted it that way. However, we can safely assert, at best, the results were mixed. A survey of sensory deprivation research found that isolation enhances people's susceptibility to external influence, essentially starving them of information and maximizing the impact and the reward value of whatever information is made available to him. But it also notes that subjects of higher intelligence or complexity, if they recognize the manipulative intent of the experimental treatment, exhibit resistance and even a boomerang effect. So there's this book called War of the Flea, and in one of the chapters it talks about how conditions, even though the conditions become worse, that doesn't necessarily mean that there will be a revolution, but because the conditions get worse, it does trigger in people who, again, notice the play to become activated. So so that's why he says that it went both ways. Those same conditions can either create a passive person or it can create a revolutionary. And because those conditions that created a passive person, a docile person willing to go along with the status quo, yeah, you get that outcome. But because it is possible to create a revolutionary, the system is always in danger of being overthrown. So violent repression has to be a constant, basically. But it also notes that the subjects of higher intelligence or complexity, if they recognize the manipulative intent of the experimental treatment, exhibit resistance and even a boomerang effect. According to Louis Joylin West, certain drugs have been proved effective as reinforcers of desired behavior. It may also reinforce related or conditional behaviors. This may be true, but when captives throughout New York prisons began to realize their food was drugged with tranquilizers and other substances, they stopped eating it. After going on a hunger strike, one of them told the Black Panther, "I started feeling better immediately. The drowsiness went away, and I felt stronger and more alert." To my knowledge, four gays who continue to have an illustrious career never produced any publicly accessible records discussing how different individuals responded to the intensive treatment he exposed them to at ACTEC, or what was done with this knowledge. One thing is certain: the RX program failed to break Messiah's mind, and on June 29, 1973, he was transferred to the so-called open prescription program at Comstock, where he met and became fast friends with Daruba bin Wahad. According to FBA, FBA, yo. According to FBI, same thing, same thing. According to FBI surveillance from this period, Comstock was teeming with Black extremists who were well organized and engaged in almost daily confrontations with the authorities. Messiah recalls receiving a visit from the FBI shortly before his parole. After arriving by helicopter, Bureau agents questioned him about his political philosophy and his post-release plans. He concealed his true thoughts, just as he had done with the RX analysis who had been probing his mind. And yet, Messiah knew that they knew that he had not been quote unquote rehabilitated, that he still embraced revolutionary politics. Months later, when he and his new wife, Zuri Mungbuk, I know I'm butchering that name, were on the outside and working with the BLA, they articulated their political beliefs on their own terms. We have been and are still, as are a number of other brothers and sisters, committed to the Black liberation movement, dedicating and activating our lives to the struggle for total liberation, freedom, and self-determination for our oppressed people, especially with the revolutionary intent to replace the present social order with a scientific socialist order with which to meet the needs, wants, and aspirations of the oppressed people as a stepping stone toward the salvation of all the world's oppressed inhabitants. Direct quote. Messiah's ongoing commitment to Black liberation and socialist revolution demonstrate the particular failure of these carceral technologies to change his mind. Mutations of a Cognitive War is the name of this section. The year of 1973 saw the decline of both prison-based behavior modification programs and MK Ultra. Sorry, I get like a short breath because I have COVID right now. It is kicking my ass. It's kicking my whole ass. And it's day 7. The year 1973 saw the decline of both prison-based behavior modification programs and MK Ultra. On June 20th, 1973, NYDOCS announced that it was phasing out the RX program. The CIA claimed to have shut down its brain warfare research earlier that year. From its inception, a CIA memo notes the agency pursued a philosophy of minimum documentation in keeping with the high intensity of some of the projects. However, as the cascading Watergate scandal heightened public scrutiny of domestic U.S. intelligence operations, Richard Helms, director of the CIA, ordered the destruction of the few records that did exist, ensuring that the full scope of the program would never be known. In 1975, when the Presidential Commission to investigate CIA activity in the United States was established, the person selected to lead it was none other than Nelson Rockefeller, who was then Vice President of the United States. Given the former New York governor's involvement in facilitating prison-based experiments and his family's foundation's ties to key sites of MK Ultra research, it is entirely unsurprising that his commission barely scratched the surface of CIA activities and that no records of his interviews with MK Ultra administrators were maintained for posterity. It would be a grave error to believe that these experiments in scientific subjugation ended with the formal elimination of these programs. According to Martin Saussure, I butcher this person's name every time, whose political defense committee succeeded in preventing his transfer to ACTEC, the imperatives of the RX program continued operating via normalized prison tactics. While our legal, political, and physical struggle against the RX program has forced the enemy to suspend operations at the ACTEC. The plan now is to increase the capacities of special housing units in maximum security facilities throughout the state. He wrote in September of 1973. Similar to his critiques of the transformations wrought after Attica, Social theorized that the official termination of the RX program was yet another example of a dehumanizing reform designed to confuse the prison critics. This reform, he maintained, would allow DOCS to continue experimenting on nonconformists and revolutionaries from the safety of the box, which they had been doing long before concepts like behavioral modification became fashionable. Sick, y'all. Fucking sick. Just the part I want to highlight too is that as these experiments were being done on these prisoners, that they also too formed resistance against that. Again, where there's oppression, there would be resistance. Whether we hear of it or not, it happens. And I love how they say, like, it is also on the part of us resisting why these programs like faced opposition. And it's also through the communication underground networks that the prisoners had created with the outside that we found out some of the things were happening and that some people found out during real time. Of course, a lot of it was dismissed and thought of as conspiracy, but what ended up happening is that when people would hear about what was going on from loved ones and stuff and from these underground networks, and as the state continued to capture more people, they would end up capturing people who had heard about these experiments, right? And then as they would go in and that now it's no longer conspiracy to actually see that it's real, a lot of them would become activated in this way and begin doing uprisings, hunger strikes, and anything that to resist. Although the spiritual and physical are one, those who seek to roboticize us into submission try to project into our collective consciousness their negative, racist, and exploitative ethic to place us in conflict with ourselves, our brothers and sisters, and nature. Social believe that counter-revolutionary carceral techniques were doomed to fail because their emphasis on isolation, division, dichotomization, and conquest conflict with the laws of nature, a yearning for harmony and unity. My discussion of the Auburn Rebellion in Chapter 2 showed how political consciousness was produced through a complex and multi-layered process of anti-carceral struggle that involved physical resistance, writing, and collective practices of care. Against this expansive method of revolt, the state's project was to isolate specific inputs and outputs in order to manipulate a totality they did not fully comprehend. Popular resistance to this ongoing assault on revolutionary minds constitutes an elusive terrain of the Long Attica Revolt, one that again illuminates Attica as a metonym for a protracted struggle that transcends the specific carceral site and exceeds notions of prisoners' rights. For prisoncrats, even the memory of Attica threatened their power. On September 13, 1973, captives in Comstock gathered in the yard to hold a memorial on the second anniversary of the massacre. Much like they had during the lead-up to the Auburn Rebellion, prisoncrats responded by locking the prison down and isolating those they deemed responsible, including Dhoruba bin Wahad. In an open letter to Workers' Power, the organizers of the Attica Memorial analyzed this incident as an example of how the state attempts to control our compassion for our loved ones and our friends and our beliefs and non-beliefs, and roboticize us and make us stereotypes to appease the jailers' egos. The fact that these forms of what they termed mind control did not involve scientists in white coats or advanced technology did not make them any less violent or significant. And it's interesting too, because when people describe like conditions and resistance to those conditions, a lot of times the images that we get fed and shoved down our throat are always like, and I believe in violence, but I have a point, are always often violent, but also void of the care that goes along with resistance, right? So like writing letters is an act of care. And I don't mean to just fill it with, fake positivity. I mean thinking of someone enough to take time out of your day to gather the capacity and the compassion to write to them and say, not only do I remember you, but here's what's going on the outside, and here's how we're fighting for you, and what are your conditions in there so I can tell other people what's going on out here. Like that type of writing is an act of love. Oftentimes it's not painted at that. Even with prison abolition groups, especially liberal ones that have been co-opted, they like to say that just writing the letter is the act of care and you want to just only talk about good things. That is not care. If you're being tortured, if you're being held captive by the state, care looks like, again, yes, writing letters, but also organizing on the outside to destroy that which holds you captive and reminding you that, yes, you're being held captive and yes, your reality is valid and we know it is. And don't let them trick you into thinking it's all in your head, because it's not. They are torturing you. We know they're torturing you and we're coming for you. But that kind of reassurance in letters is what I be writing my folks. And the books I send are always revolutionary rebellions. And that is love. That's active care. And that's something we, again, are trained and indoctrinated to avoid. And why ableism is so catchy in a lot of these reactionary groups, and as well as just in common practice. To devoid us of that empathy, to drain us of that empathy, to train us that is weakness. And in doing that, that is a counterinsurgency tactic. Because without care, we cannot form a sustainable revolution. We can't even formulate a strategy for revolution without care. Because what you care about is what you'll fight for. And then how you carry out that fight reflects your politics and what you do care about. So if you care about people, you would free all people and you do what's necessary to make sure all people are free. That's how that care would look. If you don't care for all people, you most likely will be susceptible to not only individualistic rhetoric and propaganda, but your strategies will reflect that lack of care and be very individualistic and doomed to fail, and will only lead you to further subjugation and the further subjugation of your people. So I like how he wrote that. A national effort to permanently incarcerate revolutionary ideas came into being. Not only did he write that, but the people who were in revolt understood that. And not only did they understand, the state understood that. So any kind of memorials, they squashed that shit. Like, oh, hold on, not y'all trying to be human. not on my watch. And they knew exactly what they were doing. That's why, when I see I call it faux positivity, because it'd be like some co-opted shit that we get fed a lot. Like, oh, dancing is resistance. No, the fuck it's not. Oh, having a U day and buying things that make you feel good, that's resistance. No, the fuck it's not. But again, they study us. They create roles and institutions of academia that is meant for people to learn how to study other people, to come back and know how to revamp ways of, again, extending our oppression. So then they co-opt our words and our languages. They see what we respond to, and then they use that as a veneer to further control and pacify us into continued oppression. Let's see. While the program was officially termed a national effort to permanently incarcerate revolutionary ideas came into being on May 10th, 1974. On that day, the FBI launched Prison Acts. While the program was officially termed a surveillance liaison program and not a behavior modification initiative, state sources provide compelling evidence of deep institutional ties between the two projects. Like the RX program, the FBI's Black nationalist hate groups COINTELPRO, which directly preceded PRISACs, was occupied with what was on the average Black person's mind. Damn. A compelling example can be found in a 1968 memo to J. Edgar Hoover, in which the special agent in charge of the San Francisco field office suggested that it would be advantageous for Black youths to aspire to become a sports hero, a well-paid professional athlete, or entertainer, rather than revolutionaries. Emphasizing his point, he wrote candidly, "The Negro youth and moderate must be made to understand that if they succumb to revolutionary teaching, they will be dead revolutionaries. This ambition to obtain a strategic advantage by degrading an opponent's morale is psychological warfare. The interest in controlling what Black people want, to whom they feel accountable, and what they fear has deep resonance with the experiments unfolding in ACTEC. PRISACS, launched 3 months after the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration terminated its funding for prison-based behavior modification research, including psychosurgery, aversion therapy, and chemotherapy. The program's inaugural memo attributes its emergence to the kidnapping and alleged brainwashing of a wealthy white teenager named Patricia Hearst by members of an avowedly revolutionary group known as the I do not know how to say this. Sambainese, maybe? Sorry, it's the SLA. Sambainese Liberation Army. While the ordeal is much too convoluted to recount here, a few significant details are worth noting. After kidnapping Hearst, SLA members, most of whom were white, incarcerated her in a dark closet and subjected her to nearly 3 months of rape, humiliation, brutalization, threats, and political indoctrination. According to Louis Joylyn West, who gave expert testimony during the legal aftermath of the ordeal, the SLA used methods of coercive persuasion comparable to what U.S. POWs underwent in Korea. These techniques were said to have induced a traumatic neurosis, which, according to West, explained why Hearst subsequently renounced her family, joined the SLA, and participated with them in the commission of several criminalized acts, seemingly of her own free will, but actually under the spell of her programmers. What West failed to mention was that similar techniques were being used against U.S. prisoners, or what he himself was involved in CIA-sponsored research that aimed to scientifically induce mental disorders and trance-like states. He also did not disclose that the SLA had formed in Vacaville Medical Facility, California's equivalent to ACTEC, where the CIA later admitted to sponsoring a wide array of mind manipulation experiments. It is interesting because, and I'll look for the book, but there is this new African psychologist who talks about how, the environment living under white supremacy and oppression is meant to trigger certain responses mentally from us to keep us mentally disabled. And they were saying that when you study behaviors of certain people, and as long as they have, and of course that the experiments they've done on not only prisoners in prison here in America, but also captives that colonized people abroad, that they were able to know that certain events would trigger certain responses to certain people and that they would be debilitated by it. I'll remember the book because it is a very interesting read. And of course, other revolutionaries have talked about this as well. If the official narrative of Hearst's kidnapping is to be believed, and there is an equally outlandish counter-explanation, then it would seem that it's PRISACTEC, it's an acronym. PRISCRATs emerged because prison-based behavior modification programs were producing blowback beyond prison walls. This possibility receives further support from another PRISCRAT memo, authored on the day of the program's launch. It cites an unnamed RX program administrator who had expressed anxiety that their efforts to scientifically control militants might be generating contrary effects. Some inmates learned the psychological techniques used at the facility to modify inmate behavior, and some could use these techniques to manipulate these political prisoner groups. This document is significant for multiple reasons. First, it shows that experiments in ACTEC persisted for at least 11 months after their RX program's official termination. Second, it shows that the FBI was to some extent aware of what was happening in ACTEC, that the Bureau had established a relationship of cooperation and knowledge exchange with RX administrators. Most importantly, it reveals that the flawed theories of knowledge, politics, and humanity that haunted behavior modification programs were also embedded within PRISCRATs. Soter was right that state actors were projecting their technocratic and white supremacist conceptions of power and mastery onto the targets of their control. In doing so, they were unable to comprehend the range of possibilities for why people adopt certain beliefs or make certain choices given their unique circumstances. Administrators of these counterinsurgency projects are inimically opposed to the idea that ordinary people are capable of thinking for themselves, deciding what is in their own best interest, or autonomously acting on their own thoughts. They saw intelligent, politically revolutionary, and charismatic individuals as vectors of a dehistoric. Damn, Orisanmi, it's the words he be putting me, having me tongue tied. Dehistoricized political contagion that mechanically infected an otherwise healthy social order, and at the broader population as mere drones who must be reprogrammed by political technical elites. You know what? I just realized I made like a really big mistake in analyzing slavery. Like Drapetomania, I being short sighted, right? I thought about it like, oh, they were trying to justify like keeping people enslaved or whatever, right? But if I look at it in the context of like genocide and colonization,